And I can remember one Christmas Eve, I was standing there at the kitchen sink washing all those glass communion cups. And I had this just horrible attitude. I'm like, everybody's sleeping. Everybody came to this Christmas Eve service, then they got to go home and be with their families. All my family's sleeping. I just want to sleep. I was in a horrible mood. And God just impressed on my heart. It was like this little whisper. Am I worth this to you? And I said, yes, you are, God. And it was like he said to me, I see you.
Today on the show, we have Jamie and Tara Dew. Jamie is the president of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, but he wasn't always the president of a seminary. He started out as a small church pastor.
Yeah, he said it was a church of less than 100, and he was there for almost 8 years, he and Tara. And Tara is also an adjunct professor at the seminary and an author with us. She just told us that she's going to be releasing a book pretty soon with Lifeway, so that's super exciting.
And some of the stories they tell about doubt today are in those moments of obscurity, when nobody knew about their church, when they were in a quiet place, really questioning whether God was with them. Mm-hmm. And I was encouraged about their testimony because we know so many of our listeners come from smaller churches and from obscure places that don't make the headlines, and they wonder, is God still at work here?
Right.
This conversation is going to bless you. We're going to talk about causes of doubt, what pushes us into those seasons where we question everything, and what do we do when we doubt?
He also talked about the difference of, help me out, intellectual doubt and
emotional doubt.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And that kind of dove right into also our fears, like how we behave with doubt and fear.
And what do we do when our kids go through seasons of doubt? All that on this episode, so let's jump right in. Guys, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks for having us.
So let's tell them a little bit about who you guys are. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Jamie, go ahead.
Sure. Jamie Dew. I'm the president of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, Level College. We've been there for 3 years. We've been married almost 22 years. We have 4 children, 2 sets of twins. Nathan and Natalie are 15, and then Samuel and Samantha are 12. We also have 2 little crazy dogs that are twins as well, Binkley and Buster. And we're the Dew Crew. So,
the Dew Crew.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well,
I feel like you need some more twins in your life.
Nope, we're all good.
We need to get our family down to see the Dew Crew in New Orleans and eat some of that seafood sooner than later.
Well, absolutely.
I felt like you were saying our story because we've been married 21 years. We have 4 kids. 2 dogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ours are not twins, though.
But we've been a big fan of the Dews for a long time. We've been trying to figure out how do we get them on the show. And we were talking about a topic about doubt. Yeah. And Jamie, you shared with me in your journey of going through a time of deep intellectual doubt and what God taught you through all that. So Lynley and I thought maybe the two of you could also reflect on seasons of doubt in your own ministry and what that has meant for you. Tara, you come with a background of wanting to encourage pastors' wives. So talk a little bit about that.
That's right. So when we got married, I became a pastor's wife. He was an interim pastor at a small church in North Carolina. And so you get married and a week later, you're a pastor's wife. And at that point, he was studying for his Master's of Divinity degree. So I was working and putting him through school and at the same time serving in the church. And so when the opportunity came for me to take some classes at the seminary, someone said, well, what do you want to study? And I said, well, I want to study other pastors' wives because I wonder how many of them are like me. They worked and put their husbands through school and yet found themselves in ministry and faced with all these expectations, and they didn't have the equipping to do it. So that's what I studied, and I have a huge heart for pastors' wives to come along and encourage and equip them for what God has called them to do.
Awesome. Jamie, is she always this happy?
Always. She wakes up and people meet her and they say, there's no way she's actually that nice.
She is.
I love you,
she's this way all the time.
Amazing.
It's pretty
funny.
cool.
Yes.
Well, let's jump into this topic of doubt. According to Lifeway research, 66% of pastors surveyed over the last couple of years have struggled to believe that God is at work in their church.
Wow.
Season of doubt. Of course, a lot of that was COVID, controversy and all that. But let's talk about doubt. Jamie, you've had a journey with this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and my journey's been really kind of twofold. I mean, I've had I'm an apologist to Christian apologetics, and Christian philosophy is a big part of my life. It has been for the entire journey of my faith. So I've had, and really all of that was born out of seasons of doubt and struggle, mostly with the truthfulness of Christianity. So in other words, I was really grinding away with those big, heavy questions of, is this actually true? And so I've gone through those seasons. I've also, another kind of doubt and struggle is probably exactly what you just indicated with pastors in local churches. For the vast majority of people that are in ministry, they spend their life in their ministry in obscurity of some kind, right? People don't really see them. They don't see the same kinds of results that they'll hear the headlines about from other churches and other pastors. And for a lot of folks, it's a very easy thing to draw the impression that God's not at work in your life, your church, your ministry in the same way that he is in other people's lives. And that is not just hard, that actually does cause and produce these feelings of, gosh, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Is God really seeking to do something in our lives, in our midst? And, the church that I pastored for a very long time, 8.5 to 9 years, was a rural church in North Carolina that was never going to make any headlines, was never going to make any big public splashes, so to speak. It was obscure in the sense that because that's the church that I pastored, nobody was knocking on my door to go pastor the bigger church and asking for my resume. That just wasn't our experience at all. And so those are all, I've had a variety of different types of struggle over the years with just, Lord, are you there? Lord, are you seeking to use me in some capacity? The big ones for me have been academic, intellectual types of doubts and struggles.
So almost C.S. Lewis kind of like wrestling about whether Christianity is just a myth.
Sure. So I came to faith when I was 18 years old after a lot of trouble, drugs and alcohol and all those types of things. And when I was 18 years old, came to faith, I fell just deeply in love with Christ and wanted to serve him in every possible way. Loving him that way led to a burden for people, which essentially led me on a pathway of evangelism. And I was reading the scriptures and memorizing it like crazy. I was studying Christian theology, and I was also sharing Christ with everybody around me. And when you share Christ long enough, anybody that's done this knows this, you eventually meet those people that are they don't have the same kind of beliefs that you do. They have lots of questions or doubts or criticisms and objections to the faith. And so as I shared the gospel, I encountered that more and more and more. I struggled a lot as a kid academically. And so because of that, I felt profoundly ill-equipped to answer those kinds of questions. And in fact, I did not know how to answer those kinds of big intellectual questions. And that bothered me because I felt that I was essentially failing God, if you will, that, I loved him so much and I wanted to make him known, and yet people were asking me questions I didn't know how to answer. And I guess I was probably a sophomore in college when I discovered that there was this thing called apologetics. And I started studying apologetics and really, I was just like, wow, I was wowed by this stuff, and I threw myself into it. I was so excited and passionate about this stuff, and study all these things. It did, in fact, help in my witnessing, because I could now answer some questions. But some questions always lead to other questions. And at some point in that journey, about 2 years in, I've noted with folks before that those kinds of people's questions, it really stopped being their questions I was trying to answer. And their questions kind of became my questions. Mm-hmm. And by this point, I had a biblical studies degree from Toccoa Falls College, and I was starting seminary. And yet I was beginning personally to wrestle with these big questions. And so in my seminary time, I took every apologetics course you could take, every philosophy class that you could take, mostly because I was wrestling with the big question, does God really exist? I look back on that. I've gone through two. I've always been the kind of guy that has these general wonderings about, and I still do this. Like, how does this make sense? And how do we reconcile this idea with that idea? I always do that. I think that's healthy. Mm-hmm. But I've gone through 2 seasons of pretty substantial doubt and struggle with my faith. And this part I was just describing is that first season. And I was really struggling with that really big question of, is there really a God? And there were 2, I think, I couldn't have seen this in that moment, but looking back on it, I can see it pretty clearly now, that there were really 2 contributors to that angst and that struggle there. issue number one was it was occurring to me that I had done more than just merely believe this stuff. I, and guys like you, had thrown my entire existence upon this, right? You get one life, and I'm spending 100% of it, every drop of it, on Jesus Christ. And yet, I've never seen him. I've never touched him. I've never smelled him or heard him, or I don't have access to God in the same way I have access to you guys right here, right now. And that, I don't know, that really began to worry me, that I was giving so much for something I'd never really been able to see. That was issue number one. Issue number two is that I didn't, despite what I might say publicly, and despite how people within my tribe might talk with this boisterous confidence, I myself didn't have it. And I think that I thought that somehow is an indictment on Christianity itself. In other words, the fact that I didn't have 100% certainty, that in and of itself insinuated that there's something wrong with Christianity or the Bible or Jesus or something, because you're supposed to have certainty and I don't have it. So maybe there's something wrong with the belief system. So in short, I did 2 PhDs. One of them came from that. And I was finishing seminary about this time, and I knew I needed to keep going. So I jumped in, did a PhD in philosophy of religion, and focused on arguments for God's existence and things like that. Studied religious epistemology, which will put everybody out there to sleep if I go into that right now. But in that process, I began to realize that questions don't insinuate that there's anything wrong with this belief system. In other words, doubt and questions are not a distinctly Christian problem. They're a human problem. This is what it means to be a human being. We are finite creatures trying to understand an infinite God. We are fallen creatures that have sinned against God, and that taints our view of things and causes us to struggle in making sense out of things. And I was just realizing through the study of religious epistemology, essentially, that this is how human beings know, and it's always partial. It's never perfect, because we ourselves can only see this much, and yet we're trying to understand the infinite. And so once I realized that, you begin to realize, wait a minute, historians have questions, and scientists have questions, and, well, really, any discipline has questions because they're human, and that's just what it means to be human. And the moment I realized that, it was like, oh, okay.
I can question this and still believe it.
That's right.
Yes. Not many people think that as a Christian you're allowed to have questions,
especially if you're in the ministry.
Yeah. And he was this whole season of doubt was happening when he was pastoring.
Are you guys married at this point?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay, and you seem like an eternal optimist type person. So is this
She was.
hard? Is this hard on the marriage though? Because he's having questions, and you're probably like, "But we know God is good, and we know that." Like,
Well, and because we had totally different backgrounds and experiences, I met Christ when I was 6. And so my faith has been a very childlike faith from the time I was little.
You've been comfortable with the mystery.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always things that I don't understand, but I'm going to spend my life loving him and trying to serve him. And I know that he's with us, and I know that he's real. And so as a wife, and as he was going through this season of just wondering if God was real, the thing that I knew to do was to pray for him, because my explanations for God's existence was my life. And so I could share that, but he had to get to that on his own.
You bring up a really good point, though. When someone's going through a season of doubt, you really can't talk them out of it.
that's what I was saying. Yeah, I mean, and it can almost become argumentative.
It could have become a fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I tried to listen. I tried to really figure out what was his questions. How was that making him feel? What fears were coming? But then I just had to pray. And I just had to pray that God would be near him and that God would comfort his heart and his mind in ways that I couldn't.
One of our guests says to be curious and not critical. So it sounds like what you're saying. I mean, you had to become curious as to what was going on.
Yeah.
What were you about to say?
I was about to say, and I did believe during this period, but I was wrestling and I was struggling. It was a, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief type of moment. But she was very wise in that she never tried to philosophize with me. She never tried to do anything like that. She also never tried to make me feel guilty or anything, because I don't think that the Bible approaches it that way at all, right? Think about how often the psalmist cries out in doubt and in struggle to understand what God is doing or where God is. Lord, how long? And God allows God's not intimidated by the question, right? John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 11 sends his disciples back to Jesus saying, excuse me, are you the one? Or should we be looking for somebody else? In short, because it's not going the way that John the Baptist thought that it was supposed to go. He prepares the way for the Messiah, thinking conquering king, he's going to destroy the Romans, and this man's riding in on a donkey. He's humble, he's meek, and he's mild. He's not what he expected, and now he has doubts. And Christ's response is just go tell John the things you see, that the deaf can hear, that the poor have the gospel preached to them. These are all fulfillments of prophecies, by the way, that John knew. And there's case after case of this in the Gospels where when people had questions, God was not intimidated by the question.
That's right.
And,
and I think you brought up a good point. So many times our seasons of doubts come when expectations of what we think are going to happen don't. And that's actually what led to the second big season of doubt, because we had a young boy in our church who was diagnosed with brain cancer. And for months, our church wept and we prayed and we begged God to heal. And he didn't. And as a pastor, having to walk alongside a young mom as she is burying her 2-year-old son, and Christians who always thought about there has to be a God, now are wondering, well, where was God? Why didn't he answer? That expectation of God hears our prayers wasn't met. And so those expectations then lead to doubt.
Hearing Jamie talk about seasons of doubt, it made me think about the episode with Adam Mason where he talked about when we suffer in the present, we romanticize the past or the future. And if you're in ministry and the church isn't going well or you're going through a season of adversity, you either want to look back on the glory days, on how good things were when you first got there or another season, or you want to look ahead to the next church, something that God might call you to next when you're finally free of the stress of leading this thing.
Well, the commentary that we talked about in that episode, which was so long ago, I'll repeat it. But, we've had that same tendency here is to say, well, this is really hard, and let's go back to the church. As if every minister or pastor out there is not having a hard time, just, processing all kinds of things in their own church. And so we just romanticize and say, well, if this doesn't work out, no problem, we'll go back to the church. And we say it kind of snarky, cutesy, when in reality, that's not going to be any easier.
Faithfulness is continuing to be responsible and doing the right thing, even when you don't feel like it. And there are seasons where you don't feel the presence of God. You don't feel the Holy Spirit moving. You don't see tangible fruit. And yet you're faithful. You wake up every day and you do what you've been called to do, believing that with time, God will bring fruit as a reward for your faithfulness.
Yeah, the second one, which was several years later, I'd gone through a phase where it's like, okay, I'm good. And I really genuinely was. But then I was as a pastor, because I pastored a small country church. When we got there, 75, 80 people on a Sunday morning, mostly senior citizens. This was not an up-and-coming community, so I was around death a lot. I did about 60 funerals in 8.5 years. And I just was around it all the time. So I'm already kind of constantly thinking about death and life after death in particular, because I'm doing the funerals, You know how the message we preach at funerals, this is her body, but she's not here, she's up there. And, I'm thinking about that kind of thing. I'm a philosopher doing these funerals. And so I'm thinking about it all the time. And then there was the little child that passed. There was also a young lady that fought breast cancer and lost. And these were particularly brutal passings, if I can just say it that way.
Where God didn't seem to be compassionate. Why didn't he intervene?
Yes.
Why did he not heal?
We prayed and we prayed, and it felt like in the moment that heaven was just silent and aloof almost. And, that can't help but cause certain kinds of questions. I remember when the child died, I remember he died on a Monday, and between Monday and Friday when the funeral hit, that I probably had somewhere between 6 to 10 of either my church members or just people in the community that would approach me and in one way or the other just simply say, I don't know about this. You know, I don't understand this, and I don't understand how God just let him suffer and die. And so you knew in that moment you had to be able to say something come funeral time, which generally I almost never, ever, ever, ever try to approach a funeral moment in an apologetic kind of way. I just don't think that's generally what you do in that season. But I knew that time I had to, in some way, make sense out of this because how raw our people were, and frankly, how raw I was.
We were, yeah.
And that led to the second, doctoral degree, and where I studied life after death. And
so takeaway is, if you're struggling with doubt, go get a PhD.
Yeah,
that's
right.
The answer. That's right. Just come
at
join
New
us
Orleans Seminary.
Come join the PhD program.
Yeah.
But it really was those seasons of doubt that led to really studying who God was in those, especially when the experiences aren't lining up with the expectations, and having to wrestle with that, knowing our questions don't scare God, but through those seasons of doubt, coming out on the other side and having experienced and know Him more.
Can I piggyback off what you just said about scaring God? The second time around, were you more scared that time? I mean, what people connect to here on this podcast is just the emotions of stuff that we go through with our spouses. I mean, you've done it once. He did his PhD. The second time around, are you like, we've done this? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, and the crazy thing was, this one touched on an even deeper subject, because we all wonder about death. Death is a part of this life here on earth, right? And, so now the questions that he started raising, well, what do we know that there's anything after this? How do we know that we can have eternal life? How do we know that our souls go to be with the Lord? Those questions are ones that we've all wondered at some point, and also to walk with people who are really hurting, and to see that young mom just weeping over the body of her 2-year-old. Those seasons will impact you in ways that are just life-changing. And so as he started researching and studying that more, I just clung to scriptures that talk about heaven and the real place that it is and the life that we have in Christ. But actually in that season of doubt, Jamie and I came face to face with death. And I thought he was going to go. I literally thought I was going to lose him. And he had an intestinal bleed in his large intestine that led us in the hospital for over a month. He was in and out of ICU and surgeries and everything. And it was crazy because we both came face to face with, what if this is the end? This thing that we've wondered about all this time that he's been studying. What happens here? And all I can say is that Jesus was with us, and his presence was enough.
Let's talk a little bit about the causes of doubt, because there's different life scenarios that happen.
Yeah.
I can think of moments when Lynley and I, because we know each other so well, have doubted the way God made us. Like, God, why didn't you make me more blank? Right? And I'm not fit for this role because I'm not this. And so it's that snare of compare that you talk about when you're in obscurity and you see other people that seem to have it all together or seem to be gifted at something. So there's questions of that. There's also just doubt of calling that happens. Of like, was I really called to this? You get to a place, you expect a certain thing to happen, the wheels come off,
right?
And then you're like, did God really call me? And then you start to doubt calling. But so calling has shown up in our marriage in different ways.
Yeah.
Constantly, yes.
So when you're going through that, what have you learned as people come to you now as someone who's been through it? Like, I'm going through a season of doubt. What can you give me?
Yeah, so doubt can take so many different kinds of forms. There's different objects or things you can doubt. Like in my life, for example, I've had the doubts about the big intellectual questions. I've also had the doubts about, my place, my calling, and all those things. There do seem to be some common denominators. I have learned, I would have never seen this on the front end of this, but now, the nice part about getting older and going through all this stuff is you can look back and you can see things so much more clearly now. Couple takeaways. It is amazing what fatigue and hurt will do to cause seasons of doubt, right? So when you're particularly stretched thin, when you're constantly attacked, or whenever you've just gone through a very difficult season, fatigue has a major effect on us. I've noticed that sin has an effect on us. Sometimes we doubt because our lives are not where they need to be, and this is just part of the way the enemy twists and manipulates our lives, that when we're in some kind of rebellion against God, and it may not even be something major that, the world would look at and say, well, that's a pretty nasty, gnarly thing. It can be a acceptable kind of sin. But anytime our lives are not in really full submission, I think the enemy takes our minds and he twists us around, because that in and of itself also produces a fatigue. I've noticed that people have doubts from time to time because they simply cannot see all the pieces. The psalmists, the Mary and Martha in John chapter 11, when Jesus finally shows up, where were you? If you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. In almost all of those biblical cases, it's very clear that God can see things we cannot see. We cannot see the whole picture, and God knows that. And so those are some causes right there. When a person, for example, is going through a season of struggle in ministry and things are not working the way they're supposed to, they can't see the bigger picture. They can't see that in that particular moment that God might be doing something, yes, for his kingdom's sake in ministry, but he might also be doing something in that moment to shape you in a particular way, to prepare you in some particular way. So like I can look back on my time as a pastor when, I'd prepare, I'd pray, I'd preach my little heart out, and nothing was happening that I thought should happen. But what I can now see sitting here looking backwards is that there was a deep, deep, deep grace in the struggle, right? And that ultimately what's prepared me well for the seat that I now sit in. Yes, it's the degrees. Yes, it's the education. But it's also those experiences that knock the edges off of you, that humble you a bit. There's a deep grace in getting humbled, right? There's a deep grace to us in coming to the end of ourselves where we fully own, open-handedly, I am not enough for this, and that it will only be by God's grace that this can be done. So I think there's any number of things that can cause it, and just in the same way that what causes everybody to believe is different, which is an interesting phenomenon on its own, in the same way what causes people to struggle will be different from person to person. And so the causes are many. That's good, quite frankly.
Well, and Satan, he did this back in the garden. Is God good? And I think when we come to those different, whether we're tired or we're stressed or we're busy or we're not sure if our calling or if we're seen and obscure, and we can ask the question, is God good? And for me, watching the progression of your doubt, rather than saying, is God good, we should come in those seasons of doubt and say, because you're good, God, what do you want to teach me in this season? And it's approaching the doubt in a different way. But Satan wants us to ask all the time, is God good? Is he really good to us? Is he really with us as we're doing this ministry? And even as you were talking about the causes of doubt, man, it's no wonder that here on the heels of COVID, the last 3 years have been hard.
Frustration.
No wonder pastors are tired and they're stressed and their churches have gone through so much. It's no wonder that we're in a season now where people are doubting. Because so many of those causes you talked about, we've lived through in the last 3 years.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm. People are broken, people are frustrated, people are stretched to the max, which also simultaneously pushes us, if we're not disciplined and vigilant to keep it from happening, will end up pushing you into certain types of sin and retreat into that. Look, I've watched through COVID, I've watched people crawl inside an alcohol bottle and never come back out. I've watched marriages, I've watched ministries, I've watched very lives get destroyed during this season because of folks turning to anything and everything other than God in those moments. So it becomes this vicious cycle, if you will, that just pushes people farther and farther away.
And maybe when people think I'm doubting, that makes them turn away from God.
Yeah.
And then Satan uses that, our very life source, the one we should be drawing closer to in seasons of doubt. People then turn to other things.
I was thinking about this in the context of parenting also.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to watch your spouse go through a season of doubt, but I think we have folks who their kids are walking through a season of like, I don't know, I believe this.
Mm-hmm.
My dad's a pastor. I'm supposed to believe it, but I'm not sure I believe this. We have at least one child that has to work it all out in his head before it makes sense, and I think he's doubting some things. So how do you be patient with a kid who is walking through some of the same seasons we've been through, but it's scarier with them?
Yeah, great question. We've been fortunate, and our kids are at the age now where they're beginning to process for themselves, but they've always been sort of postured towards trust and belief in that way. But I would simply say, I think, as a parent, you walk through it with your child in the same way that God walks through it with us. I mean, I got to go back. One of the things that this gave me hope in like the worst seasons where I was really struggling the most. There was also sort of this assurance in those moments, a calmness, if you will, that however this plays out, it's going to be okay. Because when I would look at the Bible, right, what I would find is God himself just simply being patient with his people as they wrestled with certain things. Now, there comes a point in the wrestling where it can be just become a obstinate rebellion against God, and they're going to go another direction. And then at that point, God's response is different. But when, for example, the psalmists ask these questions, Lord, how long? How long are you going to let this happen? How long are the righteous going to struggle and suffer, and how long are the unrighteous going to prosper and thrive? When John is asking that question, Lord, are you the one, or should I be looking for another? When the ladies ask the questions of God, where were you? Why didn't you show up? At no point does God seem to bow up on them and say to them, how dare you talk to me this way, or how dare you ask that question? Instead, Christ, in those moments when the people struggled to believe and asked for help, what did he do? He was compassionate to them. He was encouraging to them. He would answer the questions that need to be answered there. I knew in those moments, even when it was at its worst, that I was allowed to wonder. I was allowed to ask the question. I was allowed to. I was given the space to think it through, and I knew that even if nobody else around me could really calculate that or knew how to respond, I knew at least the Lord did, right? And he wasn't intimidated by my questions. So a couple takeaways on that parentally. I think that number one, when they ask the questions, we don't guilt our kids for asking those kinds of questions, right? We try to teach them the appropriate way to ask the question and go about it. We try to help them understand the cause of why it is that sometimes we have these questions. We're finite creatures trying to understand an infinite God. Fatigue and various factors go into our lives that can cause these things. We give them the space to wonder about those things, and then we engage in it with them. Even if I don't know exactly how to answer some question, I'll at least jump into it with them and try to think it through.
Yeah.
And then most of all, love them. Love them, love them, love them.
And I was going to say, so many times these questions come, at least in our family, at night when people are tired, right? It's like when you put the kids in bed, that's when all of a sudden they start wanting to talk about everything,
They want to talk to you all day long, but right then.
Right then. They've got all these questions. They want to talk about everything. And so I think it's important to let them know, it's okay. We all have questions sometimes. These are totally natural. I think you're really tired right now. So let's talk about it a little bit, but let's talk about this more tomorrow. And I'm saying, you're probably going to feel better after you get a good night's sleep, but this is an important question. So let's make sure we come back this tomorrow. And I think that's the other thing is we constantly tell the kids, like, let's just not have one conversation. Let's have a lot of conversations about this, right? So we always want you to come to mom and dad and talk to us when you have a question. We always want you to ask if there's something you're wondering about. But it's crazy because most of them come at night, when they're trying to go to bed. It's already late bedtime. And so I think helping them engage right then and knowing that it's okay that they ask the question, that we've had those similar questions, that we want to keep talking with them about it. But you also need to get some sleep. And then we're going to talk about this more tomorrow.
That's interesting. I do think it's true, though, because I think sometimes kids, I think we forget to come back to it. And so, the follow-up is the most important part.
That's exactly. Hey, you remember when you said this to me last night? Are you still feeling that? What other questions do you have about that? And it's crazy, y'all. There is something powerful about naming our fears. there's something really powerful about getting the words out, because if the fears live in the dark and in the secret places of our minds, Satan makes us think that we're the only ones that have those fears. So just the fact of speaking them, just the fact of getting them out, you already have power over it. And then when you can share it with somebody else, it becomes a lot less scary. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of Psalm 121, where the Lord says, "I am your keeper. I will be the shade at your right hand by day or by night." And I think about, in that time, they were afraid of the moon because they thought the moon was going to give them seizures, right? Lunar, they were afraid of the moon. So he is our shade by night, tells me he's our protector even when we have irrational fears. That nowadays we know we don't get anything from the moon, but they were terrified of that. Mm. But he's also the shade by day, meaning he's going to protect them from a real danger, the sun, right, as they were traveling, which means our God is a protector of both rational and irrational fears. And so if our children are afraid of something that, well, like our youngest son, he's just afraid of getting sick, right? To us as an adult, we now know how the body works. We know that just by being around a germ doesn't mean you're going to get sick, right. To us, that's an irrational fear, but God is a protector over that too. And then God is a protector over the real fears too, of what happens if you and Daddy get in a plane crash and are gone, what happens if, so there's all these different things. And y'all, I pray for our kids all the time because they are faced with so many more questions and doubts than we had growing up. They're being asked questions about their sexuality and their gender that we didn't have to ask, right? So engaging those questions with your kids. How do you know what's true? How do you know that God is good? How do you know how God created you? It's important to have those conversations.
Tara was talking about how naming fear can create power over your fear. And just how that fear ties into doubt. And I know for myself personally, I have these deep fears of different things that I don't want people to know about me because, we all want to put our best foot forward. And so, one of my greatest insecurities, even in recording this, is that I'm talking to a man who has 2 PhDs. Ben has his doctorate degree. Tara has her doctorate degree. And I'm here, with my undergrad in dental hygiene, which feels very intimidating. And so, I have a fear in this role of with Ben being the president of a publishing company. I'm not a writer. It doesn't seem to be in my future since I don't like to write. So,
there's that.
So, I have this fear of being found out that maybe I'm not as intelligent as what people may think I am.
That's good.
So, that's really scary to me. What do you think, Ben?
I have all kinds of fears. Both of my parents went through clinical depression. So I have a fear of depression. I have weeks where I feel down or downcast, and I begin to have a fear that I'm going to slip into a depression like I saw happen to both of my parents. And I have fears about our children. If you ask my kids right now, what's one thing Dad tells you all the time? I constantly ask them if they give me one thing in life that they would be close when they grow up, that they would make an effort to stay close, because it's so easy, I think, in family life to leave the nest and have nothing to do with your biological family. I have a lot of fear that they're going to spread their wings and fly and never come back. So, as you think and visualize the future, those fears can paralyze you in the present and make you wonder if it's even worth it.
So this is an interesting story, but this morning I got an email from a lady asking me to come be a speaker at a conference in Indiana. And what is so funny is that Ben's assistant knows me so well that she forwarded it to me and said, "I'm assuming this is a no." Because she knows that, I just have this fear of standing up in front of an audience, and I doubt myself so much that, I almost sometimes don't even pray about some of these requests because I think, well, God can't use me. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say no and find an excuse as to why I couldn't do it. And maybe I can't. I definitely, it's something to pray about. But my doubt of myself doesn't even allow me to process what could be.
I would say our intimacy in our marriage, we have been the closest when we've been very raw about our fears. Like very honest, to the point where you're almost humiliated saying it out loud. But I have a fear that this is going to happen. And when I share that fear with you, and you meet me in that fear, I feel connected. And so I think what she's saying is so true. In seasons of doubt, what the enemy wants us to do is just hide in it, hover it, hoard it inside, instead of speaking to the people we love about the doubts we're experiencing. So you guys are in the full-time, your gig is to prepare people for ministry, right?
Yes.
You're preparing them for the glass house.
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
And we live in one.
Yes.
So much of that is creating healthy expectations.
Amen.
Of you're going into the local church. It's a spiritual battle. How are you building this mindset that I'm going into a season of suffering? Like, this is not going to be easy. There are going to be times when I want to quit, or I'm not going to see God at work. What do you say to young people as they're like green and running into the church and they think it's going to be great?
Sheep bite. And, sometimes they do great things too, but ministry is not for the weak and weary at all. And in some sense, we always want to be real careful, because there are people around the world right now that it literally is costing them their life for obedience to Jesus, and we're not having to suffer to the point of bloodshed like they are. Yet there is also a very real sense in which for every single one of us, when we answer the call, what it actually entails, we have this, I think, a picture in our head of what it's going to be like. We envision standing in front of large groups of people and preaching and watching the masses get saved, and oh, how joyful that is going to be. But the way Jesus described being a part of his kingdom ministry, when people said they were going to come and follow him, for example, Jesus said, yeah, well, the foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. When James and John aspired to greatness in the kingdom, which a lot of times I'm afraid that's what we think we're getting into, and we're willing to do ministry if that's what's involved. Yet Jesus said, are you able to drink of the cup that I drink and be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized? Meaning, cup, suffering. He himself would pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. This is a reference to his own suffering that he's going to endure. And the baptism, of course, is a picture of death, burial, and resurrection. So when he's asking them, they think being in ministry is ultimately about platforms. Let us sit on your right and on your left. Jesus says, can you drink of my cup, i.e., can you suffer? And can you be baptized? Can you die? Which is to say that actually discipleship and ministry is learning how to suffer and die. Jesus would go on and say, he who would follow me, let him take up his cross and follow me. And I know this sounds strange, and I don't want to sound, there was a very real, I talk about this kind of stuff, so this shouldn't, if anybody's ever heard me talk, this won't be a surprise to them. If they've never heard me talk about it, they may be surprised to hear me say this. I flat out, straight up, did not want to be the president of an SBC seminary. The reason was because I sat on Danny Aiken's cabinet for 6.5 years, and I had a front row seat to the bullseye on his back. And I knew if I stepped into that role that there would be a bullseye on my back, and that she'd have to watch, and there'd be a bullseye on her back, and then my children would have to watch and have a front row seat to that. And I was not just like no to that. I was like, heck no, I don't want anything to do with that. And I want to be careful here, because, again, there are people that their obedience leads to bloodshed for them at different parts of the world today. But I knew when God was calling me to this that there was a very real sense that I was, taking up my cross and following him, because to say yes to this meant a bullseye, and it meant constant targeting and attack for things fair and unfair. Because let me be honest, yes, I make my mistakes and she makes her mistakes, and, we get blown to smithereens when we do that. And then there's times when, no, in fact, we didn't do that at all. Mm-hmm. And yet you get blown to smithereens for that too. And it's brutal.
And there's nothing you can do about it.
And
there's
nothing you can do about it. It's absolutely brutal. And I knew that day was coming. And I will have to say this simply, being the president of an SBC seminary has been exactly what I thought it would be. Every single bit of what I thought it would be. The parts I thought that I would love, I love. And the parts I thought I'd hate, boy, I hate them. But I know that God's called me to it. And I just would say, at varying degrees of detail, for anyone who says yes to Jesus, that is the call. Do not walk into this thinking that you've got a bunch of platforms waiting on you, a bunch of spotlights waiting on you, and a bunch of applause waiting on you. Expect difficulty, expect trial, expect joy unspeakable, but in and through the struggle, because you're following him. And as he said, if they've hated me, they're going to hate you too. And this is what it looks like. And so I do think But I will simply say this, as bad as all that sounds, I will say I've found exactly what Christ said to be true. He who would lose his life for my sake will find it. So while there are costs, the joys that come from obedience and walking with him are far greater. They surpass any sacrifice I'd ever make, right? And I've always found him to be enough, every single time to be enough. And there is joy and freedom in the actual surrender that, Lord, if you want me to give my life, if you want me to walk this path and take the arrows, then I'll do it. Mm-hmm. And once you've resolved that you're willing to do that, it just kind of makes it never easy, but easier, at least, as you go through it.
And I was just going to say, in seasons that are really hard in ministry, I think there's cycles. And there's cycles where we see a lot of fruit and joy, and then there's cycles that are just really, really hard. But in all things, you remember the God who called you, and you remember his calling, and you go back to that. He called me to do this. He's not going to leave me. He's not going to forsake me. He called me to this. And also remembering that we do it for him and not for other people. He's our audience of one. And I think it's in seasons of heartache, especially, or seasons of a lot of sacrifice, that we remember, Jesus, you are worth it all. I remember you calling me to this. I remember that you are with me. And I remember that you are worthy of everything. And my job is not numbers. My job is not to make people happy. My job is simply to follow you. My job is simply to be faithful to what you've called me to today. And I can remember one Christmas Eve, I was, all the kids and Jamie had gone to bed. He had preached a good Christmas Eve service. And I was standing there at the kitchen sink washing all those glass communion cups. And I had this just horrible attitude. I'm like, everybody's sleeping. Everybody came to this Christmas Eve service, then they got to go home and be with their families. All my family's sleeping. I just want to sleep. I was in a horrible mood. And then it turned from anger to just sadness, because I just felt so lonely as I'm sitting there washing all those glass communion cups and trying to scrape off the lipstick, the red lipstick that was on all of them. And God just impressed on my heart. It was like this little whisper. Am I worth this to you? Am I worthy enough for you to wash all these glass communion cups? And I said, yes, you are, God. Yes, you are. And it was like he said to me, I see you. I see what you're doing, and you're doing it for me. You're not doing it for anybody else. No one else can see you right here. But if you're able to do it for me, and if I'm enough, then you can do anything. And I've always remembered that. Our God is with us in every season. He's called us to it, and our job is to be faithful and remember that he's worthy of it all.
The Glass House is a production of Lifeway, produced and edited by Angie Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, original music by Robert Elkins, photography by Rebecca McVeigh, and artwork by Heather Brzezinski. We are your hosts, Ben and Lynley Mandrell. Thanks for listening.